I'd like now to introduce Rich Williams, who is going to be addressing the topic of spirituality tools for counseling in the time of COVID-19. I want to tell you a little bit about Rich. He has an MDiv from ILF School of Theology and MSW from the School of Social Work at Denver University, and is a licensed addiction counselor. He also is an ordained United Church of Christ chaplain, and currently is in private practice, and also works with mental health partners as an outpatient therapist in Broomfield. And I'm happy to also let you know that he is a board member with INME, the Interfaith Network for Mental Illness, and proud that he's also a board member for Interface, and has been very helpful to those of us who've been running Interface as a program committee member, and he's definitely our tech support guru and helping with sending out announcements and many other tech related stuff. So lastly, I want to just mention that Rich has presented previously 5 years ago for Interface when he was giving a presentation which was entitled "When Therapy Goes to Hell and Theology is on the Couch." And so we want to take this opportunity now to welcome Richard Williams as our speaker for today. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Rich. Thanks so much for being here and for doing this for us.
So it's a privilege to be working in this and presenting to this community and to share my gifts with you. And it's good to belong to this group as a place to reflect and think about the ideas and struggles that we all have as counselors. And I hope that this will take you on the path to fully expressing your gifts, at least move you along a little bit, and the gifts of counseling. And perhaps in this time of COVID, finding some wholeness and completeness, both for you and for your clients. So to start, I'd like to share a hymn. We don't play hymns very much here at Interface, and appreciate your patience as we do this, or deference. And the hymn just seems to represent quite well the concepts that I'm going to be talking about. So if you'll let me do that, let's listen. By the way, you're welcome to sing along if you'd like. So our objectives today are to use spirituality as a lens for issues, and to consider a modality that focuses on spirituality in the context of counseling, bringing spiritual tools to bear on the tasks of counseling, particularly in this time of crisis. And in order to do that, we'll assess and use some spiritual strengths. As I talk about a modality, by the way, I need to let you know that one of the clients I'll be talking about later as a case review was the start of this thought about how might I use spiritual gifts in a counseling setting such that folks can listen and understand and get something from my spiritual background and the education that I have. But it's not complete. And so I'm, again, thankful to be able to present some things to my colleagues and friends here, and would encourage your comments. So the idea is to assess and use spiritual strengths in counseling, to use both our strengths as counselors in the spiritual realm, but also to use the spiritual strengths of our clients. Okay, and this should work for folks that are religious or not religious, and might give you an opportunity to acknowledge their spirituality. We all seem to have some kind of spirituality, and I think the things that we'll talk about, tools that we'll be using, are are generalizable to anyone, whether or not they recognize them. We'll do some case reviews to show you how this modality works and kind of the outcomes that I've had. I have picked the ones that were successful, so you can see what the successful outcomes might look like in using this modality in a clinical setting. And there are some challenges I've been working on, maybe you've seen them also, of times and places where spirituality is a power that's used for the dark side. And the dark side of spirituality is like conspiracies, irrational, unworkable beliefs that are shared by many and often make difficulty in both counseling, but in our clients' lives and parishioners' lives, I would imagine. So just a little bit, why should we be talking about this? How is this important to counselors and pastoral counselors? There's some phenomenal statistics. These are from the National Institute of Health. They were collected back in May and April by survey, and they asked people about their signs and symptoms and decided what diagnosis one might apply to their surveyed clients. And what they discovered is that it looks like a 7-fold increase in depressive signs or symptoms, and especially in the cohorts that you see here. It's also true that about 3 times as many people have experienced, in other words, an increase in the number of people who have anxiety or could be diagnosed with anxiety of any kind, have gone up from 18 to 25% of the population to as much as 63. So that's a tripling or more. And again, it's in these cohorts you see. Remember also that depression and anxiety often occur together. Okay, and those with stress, now stress isn't really a diagnosis, but when asked and when surveyed about various signs of and symptoms of stress, the normal incidence of this is about 20% of the population, was as high in their survey as 81%. And likely following that, PTSD increased from 2% to 8%. So the same kind of quadrupling in those areas. So at Mental Health Partners, we're seeing more people. We're seeing the people that we have seen in the past affected by COVID. And so it's an important topic. And what I'd suggest is that we use a spiritual lens for these issues. And as a counselor in a mental health agency, a private practice setting, and a house church setting, I use the spiritual lens with every client or parishioner that I deal with. Existential or spiritual issues are fairly fundamental, and many of my clients are in difficult and challenging life circumstances, even without the complication of the pandemic. So I often use this. I used this long before COVID, but it brings it to the fore at the moment. And usually using spiritual strengths that they have as clients and parishioners, and addressing the spiritual and existential issues that they face, is something that I often have to start with. With COVID-19, we can find many of or most of our clients facing existential or spiritual challenges. So let's just take a look at what clients might be facing. So this is kind of the definition of existential and spiritual issues that revolve around death, freedom, isolation, and a sense of meaninglessness, or vice versa, the sense of purpose that we have. And we're concerned about what we are going to become, life, and inevitably there's death. How can we be and feel free in a life of fearful situations? And how to know what we are going to be doing and whether it works for ourselves and for others. So those are the one domain. And then another domain is, what is the universe giving me as gifts and calling on me to do? How can I find myself a place in that and flow with the kind of chaotic processes that are kind of typical of the universe and the world? we might presume there's an order, and we'll talk about that a little later, but it can seem chaotic to those of us who have only the vantage of our individual or community places. And how can I know that I'm a part of these communities and part of the universe? So what's my part, and how do I express myself as an element within that? So the existential challenges or spiritual challenges of COVID-19, most people have had some brush with serious illness or death, and it can become a personal concern if one is going to the grocery store and other kinds of places. There's lots of grief for those that are lost, and anxiety for what's out there, and that may challenge people's faith or their belief in the good outcome of the universe at some final end, and definitely that they lose the sense of control. Things are chaotic. People have trouble finding their way when things are chaotic and begin to feel out of place and that they can't find their place. There are lots of polarized responses to the community challenge that we have with COVID, and in our individualistic culture, we tend to find individual approaches. And that, of course, leaves people with lots of choices about what to do, but not much direction, particularly since there's this widespread and public denial of expertise. It's hard to find out what the truth is, or how to establish what the truth might be, and how to figure out which is which. And as Mark Twain said, common sense is neither common nor sensible. So we don't have a lot of tools. It makes it very difficult for us and our clients to sort out what's going on. And there are also some agendas that are intended to clash and divide us, rupturing community for most people. So people and lives appear to be dismissed as externalities. Externalities are something in economics, and they're created for, in order to handle those things that don't seem important to the main goal of a business, for example. And that is the making money. So what happens is that those things that don't provide a profit or increase stockholder value are put off to the side. They have to be managed, of course. Businesses manage illnesses and absences, and including people dying, but it's seen as a cost of doing business and not something that the business needs to promote in one way or the other. Okay, and then people and lives appear to be, as I said, dismissed that way, and that leaves us feeling like we don't belong and like we're on our own. And that isn't very helpful, I think, for our clients or for us. And then when things are chaotic and upset is when oppressive forces tend to find their teeth and begin to move about in society and press their agendas. People with privilege assert their privilege, sometimes at the expense of regular folks. And most of my clients are not the richest people in the world and are often on the street, for example. So how does this manifest in client spirituality? I'd like to introduce you to a word, if you don't know it already, and that's lamentation. Okay, it may, and it's a religious word. It seems appropriate here. Biblically, this was accompanied by tearing of cloth and our clothing, sitting in piles of ashes that would burn us and irritate us when we're sweating or sitting in the Middle Eastern sun. And we don't use that ritual. It's a Jewish ritual. That's archaic Jewish ritual. People don't do that anymore in the Jewish tradition either. But it helps us understand the essence of lamentation and the seriousness that people in those days provided to us, and give us a sense of what we might think of it today. So the audience for these demonstrations was God, was the universe, for all human authorities that could reasonably be accused of whatever it is that we're lamenting. Feeling betrayed by those anchors have left our clients unsettled and feeling lost. A lot of people are angry at those things that were important to them in life or that they honored in many ways, like life and the universe, governments, and authorities, as I said before. And it leaves them forsaken. There's sort of a lost feeling that they may have, especially those that are touched by the virus and didn't receive the care that they needed, or weren't allowed to stay in the hospital, or were not taught how to do what needed to be done for COVID. So this leaves them with kind of an unstable feeling, somewhat tenuous, unsettled. There doesn't appear to be a path. There doesn't appear to be a thing that we should all be doing, or a sense of working together to handle this thing that is troubling our community and us. Okay. And though people may feel isolated, there's also this opportunity to find ourselves in a community. And that community being the common humanity facing this plight. Not many of my clients do that, but it is there for people to find. But all in all, most of my clients and parishioners find themselves adrift in a perfect storm. No direction, no community, no purpose, and no sense of belonging. So what spiritual strengths might clients have that might be useful here? So one is compassion for others who are struggling through this and maybe finding different individualistic ways to meet the challenge, and some that don't work for them. You know, you think of the mask wearers or those that don't wear masks in grocery stores, and then compassion for themselves as they go through this difficult time, not worrying about the fact that they cannot work, or that because they've lost their work, they're still a significant person. It shakes their faith is something that clients have and can be used. We'll talk about finding a path out of things and understanding that there's a place for folks in the world. The other thing that some people have, but it's helpful to develop if they have even a little bit of it, and that's a sense of time. That might be a divine sense of time, that there's a long haul, that our lives are just part of a great flow of life, and it's also a Buddhist concept, and that we can find our little bit in it, and to know that there's something happening way beyond us. So that if we feel lost at this time, there may be a time later on where things come together the way that we think they are. So also a sense of universal belonging that people have, all being part of God and being part of the body of Christ, for example, or being part of the Buddhist idea of the ground of being kinds of things. And then some people have an access to their ground of being, for example, a sense of peace that comes with either their religious practices or their spiritual just beingness, and a certain groundedness that comes with all of that. All of us go to have our communities of support, or at least most of us do, and those might be the churches that we go to, they might be the sanghas that we join, might be the synagogues that we go to, and they might be just our group of friends, and maybe both of those. And there are rituals and practices that help us focus on all of these strengths and bring those strengths out. Okay. So just a summary of research on spirituality. Women appear to be more likely to respond. They seem to be more sensitive to spiritual interventions, for example. They also tend to alter their spirituality when serious illness or their children are involved. And so women may be more amenable to this particular approach. People who practice spirituality and were well in a spiritual sense, or reported that they were well in a spiritual sense, generally reported a better quality of life. So it seems like a good idea to work on these and increase these. Faith, having some belief in something larger than themselves, actually gives people a sense of an increased sense of control. So this was a study in older nursing home residents, terminal patients. And it wasn't that they necessarily thought that they could control anything, but that they were part of something bigger than themselves, and that they were part of that flow, and that they could let go of their individual control to have something greater. So oddly enough, that seems to work for people, and using that spirituality gives them a better feeling of control, particularly in, as I say, nursing homes or places where their sense of control might otherwise be compromised. So they're willing to let go of that control if they have faith. There are other things that you hear about spirituality and prayer and practices and their impact on others. There are findings about praying, and as we spoke about in the second bullet there, quality of life is increased by people who have practices. So prayer is actually good for you. If you are ill and you use prayer as a regular practice, you will tend to do better than the control group that doesn't pray, for example. On the other hand, praying for other people isn't quite so clear that it has any impact for that other person. It may make you feel better as a person who's praying, but it doesn't necessarily change the well-being of others. There's also some other studies about healing, mental health, and what kinds and types of faith and other spiritual strengths might occur in those folks and how it impacts them. But again, those are not very clear. Part of the problem is finding adequate measures of religiosity and spirituality, and understanding those is not, as we'll talk about a little later, there really aren't good measures. So the research can't be done. So what strengths might you develop as a counselor, might you use with others who are facing these kinds of problems? So these are kinds of the skills that I identified seem to be working with my clients. Okay, I don't know that these are going to be anything earth-shattering for you, but there's a thing called the Ministry of Presence in Chaplain work, and it's very much like Rogerian unconditional positive regard. It's just being there, listening, not responding negatively or with judgment, being welcoming to them and everything that they say, and responding in a way that's and letting them know that what they're doing and saying is appropriate for them. Active listening, and not moving too quickly to problem solving, because then clients get left feeling like they're a problem to be solved, as opposed to a person with all of the things that people have. Okay, you want to deal with them as someone who can be whole and complete and perfect in and of themselves. We'll talk more about that later. So the other is to show compassion and be of service. Showing compassion to someone gives them the modeling of how to be compassionate with themselves and with others. And then being of service to them also invites them to be service. I think it was Martin Luther King who said that all you need to do to be great is to serve. And this gives people a sense of purpose and significance, and even belonging in most cases, by doing service. So showing them how that's done is helpful. Empathy, of course, and then letting them talk about spiritual issues and strengths, their beliefs and their faith, whatever that looks like to them. There are some dark sides to watch out for, and we'll talk about those a bit later. But if you can let them do that, that will be great. Not sure what happened to this slide, but that's supposed to say under trauma-informed care, sorry. So trauma-informed care is also going to be important. Most people have trauma sometime in their lives, and they can react to stimuli that remind them about that trauma. There's been a movement in the counseling world and in the church world to be careful about, church and synagogue and religious world, to be careful about trauma and to provide trauma-informed interactions and care and environment. And one of the things that's important is to let the client feel like they're in control. So in client sessions, it's letting them manage the flow and the pace, what we talk about, what we don't talk about. And of course, as a counselor, you need to guide and make things move along, but you want to leave the client with a sense of control about those things, okay? Okay, and then there's listening, as we've talked about before, and offering empathy and understanding. Again, listening without judgment. You want to avoid pronouncements and giving people answers. A lot of people want answers, so it's sometimes hard not to do that for them. But the answer sometimes may involve triggers for their trauma, and also make it feel like it's you're telling them what to do rather than a flow, a cooperation, working together on something. And the last is second to last is to keep that, know that communication's imprecise. And we can only approximate the intended message we give to clients, as well as the messages that we receive from them. So what you say may not be intended as a trigger for trauma reactions, but it might end up being that way. Or you might be hearing something from your client. This is an active listening principle, and not hearing it correctly. So you want to reflect and make sure that the client is understood, and that'll make them feel like you can handle their trauma reactions if and when they come. And you want to be available for feedback for clients. Okay, so what is triggering? What can you say? What can't you say? What works and what doesn't work in counseling with them? Okay, so transforming the suffering is another principle that I think is important. It has a spiritual undertone, kind of reflective of Buddhist thought. For example, so the question is question is what to do about pain and suffering. And as I often tell my clients, the path to wellness is going through the illness or condition, that there isn't a way around it or over it or under it. All there is to do is to go through it. And pills may make it easier to go through. Medicine is a good thing, and it makes it easier to participate in therapy, and it may make it easier for them to change and adopt new practices and new thoughts in their lives. But it isn't about fixing, and it isn't about going around it or stopping it or resisting it. So fixing is for plumbing and electricians and maybe doctors, but for us, unfortunately, there's only going through it and being with our clients as they go through it. So we stand beside, and our counselors, and we, as counselors, we stand beside our clients and parishioners as they go through these things. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about how that might work. Okay, and thanks to Rebecca McBride for her article that this came from. So there's transformation. So let's take a spiritual approach. We're going through these spiritual issues, on their own terms, what therapy practices and tools might we develop? And these are tools that I've discovered as I was working. They may seem rather obvious, but I think you'll find it interesting how I've worked with these. So hope, love, belonging, and the path seem to be the things that were most effective in working with folks who were anxious, depressed, or lost in the world in some way. And the important thing was to, for hope, was to see life as a possibility, victim kinds of consciousness and other ways of looking at life don't create that. And what we're looking for is the peace and wholeness, a sense of abundance. And the Jewish people use a word for this, a shalom, and they wish each other this each time they see each other, or as they begin worship and as they end their relation and their connection with people. It's the hello and goodbye of Hebrew. Love is a contentious topic. It's one that there's lots of myths about and misunderstandings about and collapsed domains. Love isn't really love unless it's unconditional, and once it's unconditional and it's truly love, then it's inexhaustible. Giving love, a little bit of love or a lot of love, still leaves you enough love to give to the next person and so forth. So to understand that love is not parceled out, that love is not given for any particular reason or withheld for any particular reason is very helpful for folks in our culture, I think. Mistakes will be made, and with love, there's a way to recover, okay? A loving person will listen and allow you to make amends and do what needs to be done. I don't talk about forgiveness in this presentation, but it is also a tool that you may want to use. And it's important for clients and for all of us, I think, to know that we're loved, even if we fail and even if we don't behave well. And again, there's no scarcity of love, and to let our clients know that in order to have more love, which we all want, all they need to do is love some more. So belonging, and one of the things that you might do as a counselor is to show inclusion. So all of us are a part of something that's bigger than ourselves, the universe, life itself, the unfolding evolution, God's plan, whatever you would like to use. All of those are spiritual, and there's something's been created. We live in a creation that was created by something, and so the creation and all of those things, I use God here, but it can be any of all of those things, will stand by us and by most humans. And the other thing that is helpful is that we belong to humanity, all of us. And one of the things I've discovered, and I like to share with clients, is that most human beings who are with you, not all, but most human beings want you to win. And the reason they want you to win is because when it comes their turn, they want to win too. All right. And then belonging is important and connected to significance. If we feel like we're significant and we have a community, then we're that much closer to being whole and complete. And then there's a path, okay? So you as a therapist or a pastoral care person might suggest progress, taking on the long view of a person's life, the long view of this particular episode in life, the long view of COVID, and as Martin Luther King said, the arc of the universe may be long, but it bends towards justice. Gives some people solace when things are particularly unjust or not working. So use that. And that we're all engaged in something as humanity. We're engaged in increasing knowledge and wisdom. We collect that knowledge and wisdom as a humanity, as a race, as an animal on this planet. And they're part of that. Okay, it has a trajectory, and it's the trajectory that humans and humanity are on. And that shalom is the goal of each of us, and that's shalom for each individual, but also for communities and churches and synagogues. All the object is to be whole and complete. So the other thing I discovered in working with spirituality is that transformation is likely the path. I was mostly taught a different kind of view, that we need to teach clients skills and they need to, accumulate those in a particular order, and they're going to work on making those skills perfect and getting those right by practicing. and then they're going to get it. They're going to be able to do it well in one part of their life, and then they're going to apply it to new parts of their life until their entire life is covered by this skill. And they're going to get this awareness bit by bit where those skills can be used and be used effectively. So that's kind of the classic view of counseling. And there's these times when there's sort of leaps in understanding and people seem to take off, but mostly it's linear. Is the way that lots of us think about it, or it was thought of in the past. So I'm going to suggest that for me, counseling is transformation is what I look for. Insights that clients have create a whole new world for them. The old insights that it's very CBT and or cognitive behavioral therapy idea, and that is that the ideas that we have or the beliefs that we have might hold us back if they're not workable. And so those kinds of insights create a whole new set of possibilities for clients. Okay. Now, the thing you have to remember there is that it's hard to change. Transformation is change just as much as any other kind of change. It's difficult to do, and occasionally, it's hard to notice suddenly, the insight might be resisted because, like I'm 65 years old and much of my life was spent thinking that the world was a difficult place, a hard place, and that I was not capable of doing things in it. And then when I found out that maybe wasn't true and that I was capable of doing things, then I had to recognize all of that lost opportunity that I'd lived life with this wrong idea for a long time. And so there's going to be some grief and adjustment as people move through those, what I call bottlenecks. There's just places where the old beliefs are still operating and the new beliefs haven't quite taken off, and people need to kind of work their way through it. Okay. And again, this relates to those crises that we were talking about, is that people need to go through these crises in order to arrive in the other side of the crisis or the new world that's on the other side. And there's usually a sense of freedom when this happens, because the world looks like it has infinite possibility, or at least compared to the one they were in before. And so it's that's the kind of freedom that I'll talk about later also. And awareness comes in small bits and large bits, just depends upon what people are working on and what they see, what insights they have. So the question to work with from this kind of modality as a counselor might be, what might be helpful to transform? If we could pick anything in this person's life, what might we try to transform? What possibilities might we bring to this client that they don't have and would make a big difference for them? Okay, what's missing that would make a difference for them? It's the phrase that I like to use. So the other thing about this is that in order to transform, we as practitioners need to transform as well and show our clients the way that happens. But also when we work with someone like this, we're going to experience that transformation. So we actually need to step into the darkness that our clients are in and stand by them, help them recognize the insights that they might need and offer those if we can. And there isn't any pulling them out into the light. You have to get messy, as we probably know from our counseling experience. So let's talk a little bit about hope. So here are two models of hope. Okay, there's a standard model. It's full of all the kinds of goal-oriented strategies and being motivated. And my suggestion is those are actually symptoms of hope. So you have hope if you've got all of those. Okay, but how do we develop hope? How do we help people get hope? Okay, we could encourage them to have goal-oriented thoughts and be motivated and have some strategies that we develop with them. But in my experience, that hasn't been terribly helpful. On the other hand, suggesting that life is a possibility, that being a victim of life is narrowing and doesn't leave us with a sense of fullness of life and a place for us to express ourselves and be complete and whole. So what I look at with my clients and would encourage you to do is to see what's missing that makes a difference versus what we're doing wrong. Unfortunately, there are often things that there aren't any right things to do. There are only wrong things that are wrong or right or some kind of relative thing. So I choose to help people see what works in their life and what works for them, what works for everyone around them, and what works for everyone with no one left out is kind of the approach that I take. Okay, that way they don't choose options that make their life work at the expense of others. Doesn't work very well for most people. Okay. And I'm not talking about woo-woo hope here, like hoping tomorrow would be sunny. We have no control over what tomorrow's weather is going to look like. So, we don't. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for people seeing life as a possibility and taking action on the insights that they have out of that. Okay, let's talk about love. It's my favorite GIF. So love is abundant and inexhaustible. It's like this GIF. It runs over and over and over again and is always available. And only unconditional love is love. Okay, we often have some collapsing of domains here. What we see on TV is, and in the movies, love is neither this sudden urge to couple or admiration of like Cinderella for her prince, but it's really something else. And being shown that this needed aspect of our lives is available and available to all of those, all of us would be better than what we usually see on TV and experience in our culture, which is it's very easy to have it if you're beautiful, wealthy, have the right car, the right home, or the right job. Okay, and that kind of view of love, that collapsing of the domain between admiration and love, degrades the connection, the power that love has for connecting people. On the other hand, it does tame it and harness it as a power to be used and abused by those who oppress. Okay. Sometimes love hurts and it can test our integrity. Okay. And we have these ideas in our culture, I think, that don't take love into account. Toxic relationships, or some of my clients have this funny idea that they have no relationship with this person. And of course, we all have relationships. We might be fellow human beings and that's it, but we all have relationships, and therefore those relationships can be changed and altered if we choose. And I have lots of clients who like to indict other people because they cross their boundaries and they make them wrong, which is also not a very loving thing to do and doesn't really work terribly well. Okay. And in order to love ourselves, I maintain we have to fulfill our commitments to love and to love unconditionally those who are there for us to love. The other thing that is interesting misconception I think about love is that often people think that hate is the opposite of love, but it's not. It's indifference is its opposite. So hate has got all of that energy, and it's the energy of avoiding connection or disparaging and resisting the connection that love is. So, and I looked for some really great examples of how hate can quickly turn to love, but I apologize, I haven't been able to find a good one. But just to know that people spending all of that energy trying to hate someone, there's something there that you need to look at, and I'd look at it in the context of love. Shame and anger are problems with love. They're blocks to love, and they should be taken as a signal of a problem, something that needs to be worked on, something that's a place where a difference might be made. Something's missing. And again, love is vital to human beings. We can't really live without it. So finding ourselves and being in community Humans need the safety of belonging. They need to know that they're part of something. And developmentally, this is usually an adolescent task, but often this is not well resolved till even adult time. Community offers inclusion. It speaks of the significance of the members of it. It involves affirmation and encouragement and support. And this is something that identities and tribes don't offer. We'll talk more about that. They offer exclusion rather than inclusion. So it's not formed in love to begin with, and so therefore is somewhat lacking in therapeutic ability. So people need to see a way to be whole and complete. This is, the path that I talked about. They need to balance being and doing. None of us caused ourselves to be. We sort of came into this party already in place, and it's not our job to fix how it is necessarily, but to co-create life inside of the creation that we're given. And that may involve changing it as we do so, but it's a co-creation as opposed to a fixing something. And Joshua of Nazareth is the same as Jesus, so he said that. And how we recognize ourselves, how we come to be is to recognize and radically accept the world that we live in, to see it for what it is, to recognize that privilege in this life is to find what's missing that will make a difference in each moment, both for ourselves and for the world around us, and to make a world that works for ourselves and everyone with no one left out. As I like to say it, there are probably many other ways to say that very same thing. Okay, so all of us are out to co-create our lives. Some of us as resources for some people at some time, and some of us are coaches in this process, and some of us are creators in this time. So that's taken from Emerald's, the empowerment diagram. Okay, so assessment and use of this modality that we just described. So there are domains of spiritual strength. We talked a little bit about those. It would be nice if we could find useful and reproducible measures of those. There don't appear to be many that are very helpful for these. And then we need to think about the kinds of issues that spirituality brings up or that spirituality can address, and then ranking and Okay, we want to be able to rate these as well. Sorry that the view of the people covered up the screen for me a little bit. Here are some traditional spiritual assessment tools. I really recommend that you download my foils. I'm not going to talk about these. I do use these, and what I do is I use both of them. And I take out questions that are inappropriate. So, addressing in care is important for any clinician. These are mostly medically based. So effects on healthcare needs, for example, and end-of-life processes. And if I'm dealing with someone who is contemplating dying soon or is in their end-of-life processes, I will focus on that. Okay, these are questions that you might ask. They're widely used and they're not so thoroughly researched, perhaps. But are you at peace will bring up the issues that the client needs to deal with. And what gives you a sense of meaning and purpose, or what really matters to you in life, if you would prefer, are also good ways to find out what it is that motivates them, what it is that they belong to and feel belonging to, and what communities are in their life. Again, these are a lot of treatment principles that I derived from those 4 major things that we talked about. These are color-coded. Again, if you download the slides, I think you'll find it useful to read through them if you're interested in this. So holistic treatment is the goal. We want to, we want to treat the whole person. Okay. When you're dealing with a client, you're going to give them a sense of belonging by being a spiritual presence, a listener, and be the divine for them if they need to, confess sins and talk about things that they've done wrong and would like to figure out ways to make amends. You're going to have to listening to that is like the divine, like hearing prayers. So, and using the beliefs that the client holds would be best, rather than try to give them new beliefs. Most people don't need new spiritual beliefs, though there are some that do. We'll talk about that. And you want to have people get the idea that life is an opportunity to bloom. It's a sense of possibility. Acknowledging life is precious and limited. Offering hope that the client is going to make this. I think Barry likes to say that we can use our authority as a counselor to remind people that, or to assure people that they can get through whatever it is they're working on, that they've come to the right place, they're seeking help. Those kinds of things offer hope and create hope for clients. And there may be some things that are out of the client's control, I should say. But life itself, the universe, entity, some greater plan is working along a path, and they are part of that path. Often gives people a chance to let go of their fear and trepidations. Okay, and that co-creation is what we're doing. Okay, let's do some case reviews so you can see how this works with people. Okay, we're going to talk about a functioning psychotic disorder Buddhist. And he was the person who actually gave me the idea to begin codifying this. So I include him just for historical reference. I call it a mystic Christian. She just had has very interesting ideas about Christianity and how it works and what the Bible is and so forth. And she's a functioning OCD. She's actually quite successful, but we'll see that when we go through the review. And then lastly, we'll talk about dark spirituality, and I'll give you a case study of that and how I approached that challenge. Again, I don't pretend to have the answers for that, but we'll talk about safety and other kinds of things with regard to that. So let's talk about Rivers. So Rivers is a 60-year-old homeless man when I met him. He was a Buddhist, a practicing Buddhist, very intellectually devoted to the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. He was stuck in the moment and not able to move very far in those paths. He had hallucinations, and he had trouble with police and the community at large. He would get in trouble with, mostly because of the bizarre kinds of thoughts he would have and responses he would have to people who would trigger his traumas. He was traumatized by his mother. There was neglect, there was violence, there was sexual abuse, all of which was very confusing to him and left him without feeling like he had a family or a community to belong to. And he enjoyed Buddhism for its community of belief. His father was also violent and then abandoned them, leaving mom to raise him. And when we would speak about what happened to him and how it was for him in living with his mom, he would often imagine that his mother was outside the office with a knife. And it was very real for him at first, as we talked and normalized his responses to his mother's sexual abuse, particularly, and talked about the horror of this. Again, I went into the darkness with him, let's say, and he began, those visions began to loosen their hold. Okay. He also had compulsive, ambiguous sexual relationships. So it was not clear whether he really cared for people or not, but he was doing this coupling rather randomly, it would seem. And so that was often a source of difficulty and trouble for him. And the meds helped calm down the hallucinations. He eventually did not require them, but for the moment that I was seeing him, he needed them. Okay, so by being present and not judging his trauma, not reacting other than to tell him that those were terrible things that happened to him, and acknowledging and affirming him, validating him for being able to survive those things and find a way in life despite them, gave him some inclusion and acceptance. He finally, with me, had some kind of community. And we did some trauma processing work, but it was mostly, we didn't do any EMDR. I wasn't trained at the time. And we did some right thinking work mostly, so cognitive behavioral therapy, looking at the ideas and beliefs that seemed to be getting in his way. And we looked at attachment, which he was rather ambiguous about, obviously, his natural urges and how he responded in this crisis situation with his mom, or abuse situations with his mom, and that this was the design of human beings by the divine or by the universe or by life. I think he preferred to think of it as a divine creator, and that he belonged to humanity. It didn't really matter what he felt for his mom or what he did with his mom. He was going to always be part of humanity, and I could assure him of that. He was willing to accept my assurance, let's say it that way. So what happened through all of that, we reduced his dysregulation. His mother no longer needed to be outside the door, which I presume was his mother's trying to, his part of him that wanted to stop talking about his mother and confessing those crimes that he thought he was a part of in some way. He was able to find belonging. He had a few transitory friends before this, but he managed to find himself at the Sangha in Boulder, and ultimately went to the Crestone Retreat Center. And he's been there, he was there for 3 years, I guess, and I haven't heard how he's doing now, but he stayed there for 3 years and enjoyed that time by himself, and with the retreat staff that was there. So he found love in his Sangha and in his practices. He accepted me, or at least he liked to call me his bodhisattva, and his healing, which was the beginning of my thought of, well, maybe I can do spiritual work with people. And he recognized his path and was clear about his progress in our work together. Serena is a COVID person, a person that was affected by COVID, and we needed to work through that. She didn't get COVID, but people around her did. She was a person of color, female. She's in her 70s. She's a devout Christian, had kind of a mystical take on Christianity, which was sometimes a little difficult to listen to or follow. She'd been an accountant and a businesswoman, owned a very successful business, had lapsed into homelessness for a period of time, and is in poverty, but she was living relatively comfortably, and she was happy to be able to do that. She had this OCD cleaning and these behaviors of cleaning and organizing that were supposed to, I guess, order the world for her in this unordered world that she lived in. She was generous and with money and with time and with her wisdom, a very expansive person. She met people and people liked her. And she volunteers even now for a child agency. This was part of her finding community. And her mastery is in service and compassion. And so she's been using that as a way of creating a new world for herself. She's in constant pain, which makes for some mobility problems and other kinds of issues that restrict her expression, but she finds a way to fully express despite that. And she had some cognitive issues from a brain infarct. Her spirituality was mystical, which, as I say, created some challenges for me, and not my wheelhouse, as they say, but we were able to get through that. She was very scriptural, so I needed to know a little bit about the Bible, and that I don't think I needed to in order to do this work, but she would certainly refer to the Bible frequently. And she had daily practices of reading the Bible and doing those kinds of things. And she had spiritual distress. She had and the spiritual distress was around how life didn't seem to be coming together for her. She couldn't find a purpose in life. She couldn't manage this anxiety that she had without cleaning and doing things that even she recognized were not very helpful. Okay, and then she was also in this COVID world. So the first we worked on was accepting her anger at God. She was very angry at God, and she didn't feel like she should be. So we talked about that and how that was perfectly normal in her situation and appropriate. And that's, these things happen, and why not be angry? God can certainly take it, was one of the things that I said that seemed to help. And then COVID created this challenge for her in that she would run to go help people. She was very much a doing machine. And the COVID actually helped her realize that it was a way to slow down her compulsive doingness, and it worked to do that. But it also limited her connection to her family. She did travel during this time, but she had to minimize that. And how long she stayed was limited by COVID. She's also affected by racism and sexism, kind of indifference and incompetence of the people that she was working with. Okay, that frustrated her, made her angry and upset, and had her kind of stuck at times. And so we showed her how to give that to the world, or give it to the universe, or give it to life to handle, that it'll all work out. And for her, that was God, so she gave it to God. Okay, and she recognized that she loved people no matter what, that she had unconditional love already. And sometimes we had to work on that with her children, but she knew that she loved her children unconditionally, even if she didn't say so sometimes. She found community by volunteering. She works with CASA and does a marvelous job with them. She may actually become a mentor for other volunteers. And she managed to work on her anxiety and depression by seeking calm and peace in order to hear God tell her what was next, to give her an insight into the path that she was in and this new world that she had developed for herself outside of the compulsive cleaning and organizing that she used to do, and the compulsive doing for her daughters that she used to do. So she was finding hope in moving, the Ericksonian developmental steps of going from being productive to going to sharing wisdom and leaving a legacy. She was finding that now possible for her in this new world that she was in, rather than descending into despair, which Erickson suggests is the alternative to finding our wisdom sharing abilities at this time. There was grief about the world, about changes, about her daughters having to struggle during this COVID time. She's also grieving about her functional losses due to pain and due to her injuries. Okay, and she lost some friends to COVID, and having to work through what that meant and why that happened, and how she was going to, again, turn that over to the universe and imagine that there was some greater purpose. She decided there was always this conundrum whether she should move in with her daughters or go someplace else, and she was able through this process to decide to stay in Colorado, that her community was here. And instead of going and doing the work that she would tell her daughters to do, or could tell her daughters to do, she decided to coach them from a distance rather than traveling and risking COVID and working with them directly. Okay. And she saw that the more unconditional love she offered to her daughters, the more they sent unconditional love back. So some COVID counseling tips. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just need to start with basics. A lot of people are homeless or jobless or without food, so you need to handle that. I would suggest you defer questions about why does God, or why does the divine, or why do we have this problem, or why me? It's called theodicy, all of those questions. And there's never really an answer to that. And besides, if you had an answer, it wouldn't necessarily help you. Most of us drive our cars perfectly well without understanding how the automatic transmission works, for example. So defer people for that explanation of things, because there isn't one. All right. We don't always make our problems, but we're always responsible for solving them. The reason I read that is because that's directly from Linehan's DBT courses. And to remind people that, you know, they can be angry about the problems. They can not be responsible for the problems, but unfortunately, they still have to live in the life that they're living in and figure out how to do what they have to do here. Okay. Help people process grief, kindle some hope. Okay. And then note any disruptions to community. Okay. Help them find alternative ways of connecting, you know, online groups or online AA meetings and just places for people and meetups that are online, just to have people have some way of connecting. And then there's always the dark side of every powerful thing, like spirituality. There's a dark side. I call it conspirituality. It's hijacked spirituality, and it spins us its web, as that animation is designed to show. And these are just some of them. I'm not going to read any of them. I would recommend that you be aware of the QAnon conspiracies and all of the dog whistle words and ideas that go with that, so that you can help people with those. I've had people who had the QAnon conspiracies. It's quite difficult to deal with. You know, it's an unprovable thing. You can't disprove it or prove it. And some anti-vaxxer people. And then I've had some white men, it's usually white men that are interested in the martyrdom of white men for some reason. So those kinds of things I've had to deal with. But do learn about the QAnon conspiracies because they're pretty important. So let's do a case study of one of them. I'm going to call him Donald. He's no relationship or no connection to any other Donald in the world. He wore a mask, but mostly under protest. He met online with me under protest because that was the significance of his rights being trampled. He wouldn't accept any of the established protocols that the CDC set down. And of course, as an MHP agency, we had to follow those. He would cite statistics, which are kind of in that news feed, about deaths caused by doctors, bad practice, and hospital infections and misdiagnosed deaths. That most of the deaths were really something else. We talk about flu deaths as being similar and indistinguishable, so maybe they were really flu deaths. Okay, and he knew better than everybody else. He had special knowledge. I did tell him the story about one of my clients who died of COVID. Well, she died of pneumonia, actually. She had successfully ridded her body of COVID, but the virus, the bacterial infection that she got from the ventilator tube was what her body wasn't able to handle. That stopped him talking mostly about that kind of thing. But I accepted what he said, and we talked about it. Okay, he was unemployed, mostly due to COVID. He was a little angry about that, and it's caused by liberals stopping the economy, and he had all kinds of little stories about that. When we dug a little deeper, he would finally say, well, maybe it's my drinking, maybe it's that I get so concerned about community. His community and his source of community was work, and so he spent a lot of time talking to other people when he probably should have been working. So we were able to get a little progress on that. He did have signs of future thinking, but he was unmotivated around getting jobs and coping with COVID in any constructive way. He was drinking and smoking pot, was a victim. He was a victim of everything and anything, and all of that displaced any motivation that he had. Whoops. So he was unable to find a community since he wasn't working, and he had considerable social skills. It was kind of surprising that he would have this kind of a problem. As I said before, he relied on work for his community. He was on his third career. The first career ended with an injury. He was a musician and could no longer work because he injured a part of his body that was required for playing. And the second ended with COVID, or maybe drinking, and maybe those other things that he blamed himself for. He was claimed to be spiritual and not religious. He had, some vague insights into his spirituality, and as you can see, not too many insights into his own behavior and reason for being where he was. As we spoke, he saw that, if he wanted to stay in the conspirituality, he was going to only be able to hang around with his kind of people, and they just didn't seem to be everywhere. And if he wanted to go to the grocery store, he was going to have to accept something. Okay, and like wearing a mask. And he was willing to think about co-creating a paradigm for his life, or the co-creating paradigm for creating his life, instead of being a victim. We made a little bit of progress in that arena. He was coming through the bottleneck. And one of the things that came from that work was that he took stock and thought about it. And, if he didn't need the job for community, then, he could actually afford to retire or stay where he was and be quite comfortable until for a very long time. We weren't sure when he was going to die, so we didn't know that, but he could at least afford to retire and be comfortable for quite some time. And he found an accepting, caring counselor, despite all of the things that he had to say about our rules and my having to set those boundaries. And he began to understand, that my ideas might be more workable, even if they weren't right, you understand. And even if he was a broken person, that I was willing to be with him and work with him. There was some acceptance of COVID protocols, just in case they're accurate, was an outcome. It was certainly a socially acceptable way to behave when he wasn't with his particular cohort. And even, we allowed that maybe people weren't right about this, but it was certainly the way we were all doing things. And so, or most of us were doing, so he might want to do that, or at least that the rules were that way. He had a reduction in substance use. We weren't able to get him to quit entirely. And there was some increased hope of actually a job, oddly enough, and community by contacting some of his old friends who were in the music business and reconnecting with the music world. Okay. He also was able, with MI motivational interviewing I used, he could see the incompatibility or the discrepancy in using substance use and ever driving again. So he was working on his second D or third DUI. Okay. And we developed some belief that he could do without substances. This was his new world, was that maybe he could do without the substances, and that he could find another community and he could see progress, at least in cutting down on those. Okay. This is a very long paragraph. I'm not going to read it. Again, if you'll download my slides, if you'd like to read it. But it's essentially when people who have a sacred trust, a counselor, a therapist, a pastor, a chaplain, who essentially betrays that trust and damages the spiritual well-being of a person. Okay. And these are cults. They've happened around here with abusive leaders. I've dealt with clients like that. And there are clients who are suffering from sexual abuse that occurred in the church. And I've dealt with clients who've had that. It's difficult. And then there are cults. Let's talk a little bit about cults and spiritual abuse. The way to identify those kinds of things, if you're talking to someone who isn't quite sure whether there's spiritual abuse going on or there's a cult, there's ego agendas of the leaders usually. That's control and being identified with a cult, as opposed to being humble and joining the divine and the plan that the divine has. The cult leader usually has a different kind of idea about things. Cult formation makes people right and others wrong. Orthodoxy, or right thinking and a right belief and right doing, are done at the expense of reality. In other words, people do things that they wouldn't normally do if they weren't part of the cult. Cult wisdom, the kind of wisdom that gathers in spiritual communities, is expansive typically. Okay, the universe teaches us and surprises us, and God tells us things or does things that surprise us, and we need to cope and find different ways and use our community of support as a religious institution to meet those, or even a spiritual institution. But cults do the other. They narrow down, they focus on something or someone who's right and beyond doubt. And instead of talking about compassion and service, most cults focus on servitude or slavery to the cult and rejection of anyone else. So if you want to deal with all of these dark spirituality pieces and COVID, you want to be careful. So this is essentially a safety checklist. Insist on your safety. Find some accommodations for start for those people that are rejecting the standard ideas about what keeps people safe. Do not confront their delusions. Suggest they might be right, but explanations and blaming aren't helpful. Okay. Help them understand that their ideas are not necessarily, or special knowledge isn't necessarily workable for anyone else. Okay. And suggest to them this alternative of doing what works is really capitulation. Okay. That they just need to radically accept and not approve, isn't approval or endorsement necessarily, but it's necessary to arrive at something that works for everyone. So, wearing a mask is something that we have to do. And it just works better if we do. And they can have whatever thoughts they have about it or beliefs they have about it as long as they follow that. So here are some things, if you run into a person like that who wants to do cult reprocessing or deal with spiritual abuse in some deep way, there are several agencies. Evidence-based practice includes EMDR and TFCBT, which is trauma procedures that people use, licensed psychotherapists use. And here's some reading. Okay, so we used spirituality as a lens for issues. We considered a modality that focused on spirituality in the context of counseling. I offered means of access to assess spirit and use spiritual strengths in our work with clients, and showed some successful examples of how this kind of counseling might work in a setting of counseling. And we talked a little bit about the darker side of spirituality. All right.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you.
You're welcome. Looks like we fanned out a little bit.
Mostly everybody's here.
Okay. So what questions might you have?
You've covered a lot of territory in a small amount of time. I appreciate how you were able to summarize your own work with the concepts that you were laying out.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's a bunch of therapists here on the line. We've all had clients who are struggling in some way in the last months since March. Who wants to join in here? And what has been your experience? Some things that Rich presented pique your interest, your imagination? Who wants to start the dialogue, the conversation?
So were these concepts familiar? Were they not familiar? Are they things that you use in some form?
Well, something I noticed is that, well, ironically, I was just reading an article today about a guy that runs a mental health center in Denver now that had a real transformation in his own life because his identical twin died at 15 years old and he just gave up on life at that point. And now he runs this medical center. So that was kind of interesting. It was uncanny, the parallels that you spoke about. Mm-hmm. And the article's in the Sun, by the way, but Colorado Sun. But what I had a curiosity about is from reading his article and what you brought up in your discussion was how it is that people to start with can't just be with somebody rather than solving it for them.
Mm. Yeah,
That's never made sense to me, because I don't think it's an example of real empathy, because you have no idea what your client or what this person has in their background that justifies just exactly the feelings they have.
Yep, understand. Yeah, I agree with that point of view, and I hope that I expressed that in my presentation.
Yeah. So how do you think that comes about, that humanity just seems to have this arrogance?
I don't know if it's arrogance or not knowing what to do, and so we just reach for the things that we usually use, which are, fixing things and trying to do our best to make the hurt or the pain go away, and those kinds of simpler, less sophisticated kinds of answers. And, everybody does that. I even have done that on occasion when I was, didn't know what to do. I ended up there early in my counseling career. Anybody else have an idea of when and why people might do that?
I think those of us in the field are in the field because we have this impulse to help, and we've had our own pain and suffering somewhere along the way, and we want to empathize, but don't always know what the best tool might be for someone else. So we refer to our own bag of tricks or our own thoughts of what we went through.
Right.
How many therapists here have had clients who have passed away due to COVID and had to deal with family members? I mean, I have a few. I suppose I could make a poll out of that for those people who are not showing themselves. Are there some things that you've come across that have been helpful? The silent majority here.
Yeah, as I say, I handle people's grief the way that you want to handle grief. You empathize with them, you listen to their pain, you if there's an opening to say that it'll end eventually, and that they should be prepared by preparing memories of that person that are good and that they can celebrate in the future. And then to remind them that it's a big chaotic world, or it may seem like a big chaotic world where people die who shouldn't die, or who are too young to die, or whatever the complaint might be, but that life has its plan and we are just part of it, and that's going to be the way it goes.
Rich, I'll ask you a different question. Because you have a credential in as a minister and as a therapist,
Mm-hmm.
Do you see it blending in together in your roles when you're serving in one capacity or another?
Yeah.
Because a lot of the things that you've addressed on your slides may be related to both those roles that you may play.
Yeah. I use both psychology concepts and psychotherapy concepts and procedures and strategies and techniques with my parishioners. I try to be careful there. They haven't really necessarily asked me for that kind of intervention. I'll leave it on a spiritual level or whatever level they're interested in. But I obviously have the awarenesses and insights that you have as a counselor. So I do that when I'm with people as clients. There's that agape that we Greek has 4 words for love, so that was a collapse, a domain collapse that I didn't mention in my presentation, but meant to, so that I show agape, this brotherly kind of love to my clients, and understand how and why to do that from my chaplain work. And the ministry of presence that I did speak about is an important part of what I do with every and any client that comes. Just let them know that I'm here, I'm listening, I'm willing to work with them, willing to listen to any approach they would like to take. Does that answer your question?
During this, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to jump in here? In my mind and in my practice, I remind myself that we're all living in some form of aspect of grief due to the COVID, the pandemic, and if people don't have someone who's passed away directly or have been tested positive, we all experience losses because we don't go to the movies, we don't go out to eat in the same way, we don't wander around window shopping or going to stores for no reason. All of a sudden, the paradigm of how we live our lives has shifted. And for clients who have good resiliency and coping skills, they manage better. Those who have struggled in their lives may not know how to cope as well. And
yeah.
I wonder if you have some comments, or anyone else have comments about what you switch to in your presentation, in your working with someone, when they don't call it grief, but you can clearly see the loss or the grief that's going on, that we all are experiencing. It's not just individualized. It's community-wide. It's county-wide. It's countrywide, globally.
Mm-hmm. I generally ask people if they could imagine that what they're feeling, the depression that they're in, is grief. And I do some work to distinguish depression from grief. In my practice, grief being this like missing something, this hole that you are seeking to understand why it's there, and as opposed to depression where, you're a bad person and the world is bad and it's really not anything to do and everybody dislikes you, which is depression. So I often have people come in who are expressing, particularly in this time, expressing grief and thinking that they're depressed.
Yeah, I have somebody that is experiencing grief and depression. Her husband died mid-September, or I guess late September, and she's 86, has no tech ability at all. She has a landline, and that's how we're meeting, by her landline. But she's, as it turns out, she has had depression, and the only thing that helped her in the past was electroshock treatment. It worked really well for her, but she's 86. I don't think that's an option for her now, though I don't really know. But she's feeling, I kind of feel at a loss on helping her do some of the things that would be useful. I mean, because she can't really have it. She lives in a not assisted living, it's independent, but it's a senior residence, and she can't have visitors. She can't have her children, for example, who come in. And she is not very mobile. She's got to use a walker, and she lives, it's not an easy situation. She can't socialize with the people who live in her community because they're not allowed to. They can't meet in the lobby and just hang out. And I mean, she says stuff like that she wishes she was dead, and stuff like that, but she doesn't have a plan. She has had a conversation with her medical doc, who prescribed some different antidepressants, which did not work for her. And so it's hard to see. I mean, she has some strengths. She used to work in a service capacity with social services, actually. And she did that for a long time, but she's retired quite a while ago, and is angry at her children and, angry about a number of things. But she hasn't talked about any spiritual issues. Well, I guess she has. She wants God to take her. That's what she said.
Yeah, and when people talk about hope or hopelessness, or when they talk about they talk about missing connection and being part of the community and so forth, those are truly spiritual issues, whether or not they they present them that way. And and those are hard problems. I mean,
very.
I've encouraged older people to reach out to people, and of course, sometimes they'll discover that they're gone, but to reach out to old friends and see how they're doing, and create a list of people that you'd like to contact, and you'll help her look up.
That's a good idea. She seemed like she thought she couldn't. That there were people in the building that she used to sometimes hang out a little with, and she can't do that now. But I don't know if she has their phone numbers, because that's her way that she would have to communicate.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, and I've offered to look up numbers for people. So
yeah,
if they're willing to try calling numbers that may or may not be
people
they want to reach.
Yeah, I think. I mean, her main concern right now seems to be that one that she misses her husband, wishes she was dead, and that she's unhappy with her relationships with her grown children.
Yeah.
And so I don't know exactly, I don't know her very well. I've only met with her 3 times by phone, but I've just been empathizing with the difficulty of the situation.
Sure. Yep. And you may be the community and sense of belonging and
it could
that she has.
Yeah, right. She is very lonely. I mean, she has talked about that. Yeah. But that listing people she might call, that's a good idea.
Yeah. At least give her an activity.
Yeah.
My dad always said, you are your own best friend. And I totally agree with him, retrospectively. I mean, I don't know if that's something to be proud of, but it's something I reflect on.
Yeah, it seems sad that as we age, we get relegated to these positions of not being appreciated, for the wisdom. And 2 of my clients have turned to journaling and writing their stories. And that really seems to, help them so that they've got something that they can share. Eventually, it gives them that, sense of empowerment.
Sure.
And so, that's my experience at this point. Just, encouraging them to, see that they are a treasure trove of just wisdom, and it's there.
Yep. Very true.
We're creatures that identify ourselves as doing, and then when we can't do things like we used to, we start to lose a sense of self. So the spiritual component that you were addressing, Rich, is important because it helps to remind us that we're still connected, and it's not just a physical connection on the outside, but a connection on the inside with ourselves.
Yeah.
I had for Kathy's client. is doing an ethical will. What values does she have that she would like to pass on to her children? And whether spending time with that might give her something meaningful to do.
Lynn, you're on mute.
Sorry. I saw a talk by Daniel Ellsberg the other day on Massachusetts Peace Action. And he's remarkably aged since I saw him 15 years ago. But boy, is he on top of it. He's never been more powerful in his word, and his thoughts, and to contemporary situations, and it's really inspiring to see that. You kind of have to relook at what age really means.
Yeah. I think our culture is deprecating of older people and the wisdom that they've gathered and ways that they've found to do things, and resurrecting old ways of doing things that might be just as useful right now, like cooperatives and tool exchanges and a whole variety of things that my parents' did.
Rich, I wonder if the
and that age group being more affected by COVID, you take away your transgenerational wisdom. So I'm glad that a lot of the elders are getting vaccinated first, and the service providers to the elder communities.
Yep.
Yeah, Lynn's talking about that reminded me, I just attended the Evolution of Psychotherapy conference last week, and one of the presenters was Aaron T. Beck, otherwise known as Tim Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy.
Yes.
Interviewed by his daughter Judith, who runs a cognitive therapy center outside of Philadelphia. He's 99 years old.
Oh my.
And what he was talking about was that he had been asked how he could tweak his cognitive therapy work to help people with major mental illness who were in hospitals. And so he's developed this recovery-oriented cognitive therapy. And he was describing a client who thought he was Jesus Christ. So he said to him, well, what would Jesus be doing right now? Well, Jesus would be helping others. Well, how would Jesus do that? Well, and this was pre-COVID. Well, I would be gathering food and clothing. And so he got involved in creating a service project and getting other people involved. And nobody talked about his believing he was Jesus Christ. They just focused on what he could do to help. And from his helping and putting this program together, he got empowered. He ended up getting discharged from the hospital and actually developing the ability to function on his own. And while he didn't share all the details of how that evolved, I thought was just a very interesting piece that I thought would be valuable to share.
Very neat.
Someone else?
In the chat, I put a question about one of the stories you described about the conspiracy theory patient. And what I wondered about was when you told the story about this woman that had COVID and was in that hospital and then died subsequently, but died not of COVID, but of the bacterial infection she got from the ventilator. I wonder why that death struck him, because if I were him and I believed in conspiracy, I would have said, well, you see, that's a perfect example. If she hadn't been treated, so
he had enough social skills to know that wasn't the right answer, and to know that I was touched by my client's death, and that that saying things about it wasn't going to be workable. So this is part of how we slipped into, it just doesn't work to be, to not wear a mask when people are expecting you to. It doesn't work to put forward your theories when someone is moved by someone's death. And the truth is, it doesn't matter how she died. She just,
Right.
she was my client and I cared for her and she's gone. And yeah, so this was kind of an opening for him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I have two clients that are very interesting because one is very vehemently anti-religious and is very afraid of dying. And she's afraid of dying because she's witnessed some really rough deaths in her family, and her dad was very anti-religious. And then I have another client who is a retired pastor, and he's really struggling with facing these huge changes that he's going through because of age and because of all the limitations of COVID right now. And I really liked what you talked about, Rich, about the bottlenecks between old beliefs and new beliefs, and where people really get stuck there, because that kind of resonated with me with these two clients that seem connected in some way, but also have very opposite points of view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a time to continue encouraging and supporting and standing by, and showing that the water's fine on the other side.
Yeah, I've had some trouble dealing with one conspiracy theory client who ultimately just dropped out, but he was, it was all, the election was being stolen and all that. And, he would, say, well, he basically was making all the claims of fraud that all the Trump people make.
Mm-hmm.
And, he'd say one of these and I'd be, I'm not sure about that. It just made him really angry.
Yeah.
But I was able to empathize that he was afraid that we were losing our democracy, because he stated that. And I'm like, yeah, I agreed with him on that, but for different reasons.
Yeah, that's when I kind of asked that question about what's missing that would make a difference. So, we're both committed to democracy and the full expression of democracy. And, occasionally things hiccup and don't work properly. And, so what are you going to do, to borrow somebody else's idea here? What do you think is missing that would make a difference that you could do?
Yeah.
It's not so important that it's turning out right or wrong. It's more important that we find what we can do to contribute in a way that moves it towards our goals and commitments. Kind of an ACT idea. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, he's gone.
He's gone. Oh, well.
Yeah.
Gretchen, I haven't seen you in a while. Bye. Oh, you're muted.
I hate to do this, but I need to step away for a moment.
Sure, go ahead.
I was delighted when Rich said that he was going to be doing this, and I had a little bit of conflict during the first part of it, but I jumped right in, and I've so impressed with the questions that people ask, with Rich's really great transformation kind of from the times when I first knew him many years ago. So thank you for welcoming me. I didn't want to disturb. I just wanted to listen. Thank you very much, Lynn.
Glad you joined us.
Oh, thanks, Barry.
Awesome.
I am too.
It's a delight to see you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie.
Hope you'll come to more of our interface meetings now that you know where we are and how to get on.
That's right. Well, I think I'm still on the mailing list. I mean, I know I am.
Okay.
Thank you.
As far as people having isolation, there's Zooms. I figured out how to use Zoom myself lately.
Oh.
For my kids on Thanksgiving, and you can do that. I have a group, World Affairs discussion group, that I meet with every day at 4 to 5 and 2 hours. It started out years ago, 2 hours every Tuesday, and every day you can come in at any time, come in and come out, and it just feels like home to see the same folks. Some can make it, sometimes some can't, but I feel more connection in the virus than I do kind of running around, commuting on my bike to this event and that event, and all of that time spent in between. And this is a time to just center on connections with people, kind of the cup's half full.
Yeah,
Right.
I agree. The Zoom, I think, is a real cultural gift. There you go, Rich.
We're complimented, Rich, quite deeply by Gretchen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
COVID has certainly given us the opportunity, so to speak, to have to reevaluate our values and how we've been living our lives. And each of us ourselves have made some accommodations, presumably, as all clients that we see and all people that we meet have tried to make some adjustments. So the spiritual aspect here is, in my mind, bringing the bigger picture. When I think about connecting with the higher power, or if you're thinking about some form of aspect of God, depending on which paradigm we're looking at, which religious belief we hold on to, it gives us the opportunity to think about how we're in this together. And I think, Rich, one of your points about the duality of us and them that comes from the dark side is there's a good side and there's an evil, as there is in some religious paradigms that are dualistic, that there's the chosen people and then there's the others, or there's the Christians who are born again and those who have not been saved.
Right.
And the pandemic is the equalizer here that puts us all in the same basket, the same pandemic universe. So it helps to think about how the pandemic is kind of a spiritual wake up and shake up for each of ourselves personally, as well as the whole globe and what we're doing.
Yeah. Yep.
Any other comments, thoughts, questions? Rich, do you have a concluding bit of wisdom that you want to share with us?
Just thank folks for being here and having a conversation and being a community for me and for each other. It's pretty important to do that. And, thank you for allowing me to present some thoughts that I'm working on and to get your feedback and understand. It's nice to be part of the community, feel like I belong here and feel like I can share my wisdom here. So thank you.
Thank you for what you've offered us. And I personally appreciate you so much for all the help you've given with Interface as well. And Rich is an important piece of the puzzle here that keeps us going.
Happy to do it. Yep.
So with that being said, maybe we'll conclude here. Thanks everyone. Hope to see you next month. Happy New Year. And thanks again, Rich, for the presentation.
Absolutely.
Take good care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.